I am 76 years old, and I have come to realize that silence can be more suffocating than noise because silence leaves too much room for memory, for regret, for the echo of words once spoken by those you loved and trusted, words that return in the middle of the night like waves breaking against the shore of an old, tired mind. My name is George Whitaker. I live in a modest, single-story house on the edge of Minneapolis, a house that once echoed with my wife Margaret's laughter, the noise of my daughter Elaine as a child, and the scuffling footsteps of grandchildren who now hardly acknowledge that I exist. The house, though small and nothing special to the eye, is a vessel of decades, every corner filled with traces of a life lived honestly, a life that to me once felt ordinary, yet to younger generations appears antique, irrelevant, disposable. After the stroke I suffered 6 years ago, the doctors told me I was lucky, that many men never walk or speak again after what I endured, that my recovery, though imperfect, was remarkable. They told me I should be grateful that the only real damage was to my hearing, that I had lost certain frequencies, that the world had grown muffled, but that I was still functional. They could not have known, or perhaps they simply did not care, that in my family's eyes this partial hearing loss was not simply a medical condition. It became a label, a convenient excuse to treat me as if I had one foot in the grave, as if I were already fading away, a burden to be managed rather than a man to be respected. My mornings are slow, deliberate, shaped by routines I cling to because without them, the days threaten to dissolve into shapeless time. I wake early, though I have no reason to anymore, and I sit by the kitchen window, making coffee the way Margaret used to, strong and slightly bitter, with a spoonful of sugar I pretend not to need, but add anyway, out of habit and memory. The kitchen table still bears faint scratches from years of use, and sometimes, when the light slants in at the right angle, I can see Margaret's handwriting faintly preserved on a yellowed recipe card taped to the inside of the cupboard door. She's been gone 8 years. A sudden heart attack, swift and merciless, and I have never quite stopped expecting her to walk back through the door, scolding me gently for leaving crumbs on the counter, or telling me to get outside and take a walk, before I grow roots in the chair. After she died, the center of gravity in our family shifted, and not in a way that left me steadier. Elaine, our only child, became distant, first politely detached, then openly dismissive, and eventually, after my stroke, cold in a way I had not thought possible from my own flesh and blood. She comes by when she wants something, usually money or favors, but when she does not need me, I might as well not exist. Her husband Richard, a man of numbers and hard edges, treats me as one might treat an old piece of furniture left too long in the corner, something that takes up space, too heavy to throw away but too useless to value. My grandchildren, who once ran into my arms with shrieks of delight, who begged me for stories about my time in the army, who laughed at my corny jokes, now avoid my calls, answer my questions with distracted sighs, and carry the look of embarrassment whenever I forget a name or repeat a story. To them, I am the embodiment of decline, a reminder of everything they fear about old age, and rather than cherish me, they prefer to push me aside, to silence me with the assumption that I no longer hear, no longer see, no longer matter. The cruelest irony is that I hear more than they think. I may not catch every word of the evening news unless I turn the volume high, but I hear the inflections in their voices, the murmured words they exchange when they think I am too far gone to notice, the sighs of impatience when I ask them to repeat themselves. I hear the contempt hidden beneath polite tones, the way Richard mutters about me being a liability, the way Elaine sighs that he's not all there anymore. They underestimate me because it is convenient, because it allows them to shape a narrative in which I am no longer a man but a ward, someone who must be managed, someone whose assets must be protected. It is easier for them to believe, or pretend to believe, that I live in confusion than to acknowledge that I still possess clarity, that my memories remain sharp even when my body betrays me. It is easier for them to whisper, "He can't hear us anyway," than to face the uncomfortable truth that I have always been listening, silently, carefully, with the patience of a man who has survived battles far worse than family betrayal. I did not come to this point without scars. I served in Vietnam when I was barely out of high school, a boy in a jungle where the air itself seemed determined to suffocate us. I returned home not as a hero, but as a man who had seen too much, a man who carried images and sounds that could not be shared with anyone who had not lived through them. Margaret was the only one who understood, the only one who saw past the silences and the sudden anger, who held me when the nightmares broke through. Together, we built a life that was steady, if not remarkable, a life of small comforts, of Sunday barbecues, of Christmas mornings when Elaine tore open her presents and Margaret beamed as though the universe had given her everything she ever wanted. Those days feel impossibly far away now, as though they belonged to another man entirely. Sometimes I wonder if I truly lived them, or if they were dreams I conjured to keep from collapsing under the weight of loneliness. What remains undeniable is the ache of their absence, the cruel transformation of daughter into stranger, of family into adversaries. The neighborhood around me has changed too. Younger families have moved in, with their SUVs and strollers, their front lawns trimmed to perfection. They wave politely, some even stop to chat, but I see it in their eyes. The same faint pity, the same assumption that I am a relic, a man waiting for his final chapter. They ask if I need help carrying groceries, as if I were incapable of lifting a bag. They speak too loudly, enunciating as though I were deaf, and I nod along, though inside I seethe. What they cannot know is that the real weight I carry is not in my arms, but in my heart. The heaviness of betrayal, of realizing that those you gave your life to would rather erase you than embrace you. I write these words now because I feel the story must be told, not only to preserve my dignity, but to reveal the quiet cruelty that can grow inside families, the cruelty of neglect, of whispered conspiracies, of being erased while still alive. I never imagined that my own daughter would look at me as a possession to be controlled, that she would rather speak about me in the third person while I sat beside her than ask me how I truly felt. I never thought I would sit at my own table, eating my own food, and hear my son-in-law speak of me as though I were no longer human, as though I had already slipped into some fog of incompetence. Yet here I am, reduced in their eyes to a half-hearing shadow, a man whose life they plan to manage for their benefit. And though they whisper, believing I am deaf to their schemes, I hear them. I hear every word, every sigh, every insult disguised as concern, and I remember it all. It was a Sunday evening in late October when the veil finally slipped, when the whispers I had long suspected took on a form so undeniable that even I, in my stubborn desire to believe that my daughter might still hold some fragment of affection for me, could no longer dismiss them as careless remarks or idle frustration. Elaine had invited me to dinner at their house, a rare occurrence that I accepted with the cautious optimism of a man who has grown used to disappointment, but still longs for a taste of the warmth that once defined family gatherings. I wore my old navy blazer, the one Margaret always said made me look dignified, though it had grown loose on my shoulders over the years, and I carried a bottle of inexpensive red wine as a gesture, knowing full well Richard would smirk at it behind his teeth. The evening began as I expected, with polite greetings and hurried embraces that carried no real intimacy, with my grandchildren scrolling on their phones while I asked questions they barely answered, with Elaine bustling in the kitchen and Richard talking loudly about some project at work that required his brilliance. I sat quietly at the table, sipping water, smiling when appropriate, feeling like an actor in a play whose script had been rewritten without his consent. Dinner was roast chicken with potatoes. And I ate slowly, carefully, savoring each bite because meals like this, though ordinary to them, had become rare for me. Small pockets of connection in a life that had grown too solitary. Conversation moved around me like a current, and I let myself drift in it, nodding when someone looked my way, laughing softly when others laughed, until the moment arrived when they forgot I was not entirely deaf, when they leaned closer to each other, and their voices dropped just enough to be mistaken for secrecy. At first I thought they were speaking about something mundane, perhaps Richard's work or the children's college applications. But then Elaine said in that slightly sharper tone she uses when she thinks she is being practical, he doesn't even realize half the time what's going on around him. We can't keep letting him manage the house or his accounts. It's irresponsible, Richard replied. His fork paused midair. Exactly. If we wait too long, someone else might get involved. Banks don't like this kind of situation. He's vulnerable. It's better if we step in now while we can still control the narrative. Elaine sighed and lowered her voice further, though not enough for me to miss it. I just don't want him to feel betrayed, but honestly, Dad can't take care of himself forever. The house, the savings, all of it, it'll end up wasted if we don't act. I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth, the taste of chicken turning to ash on my tongue. In that instant, every suspicion I had nursed, every uneasy glance exchanged between them, every impatient sigh when I asked for clarification, all of it hardened into certainty. They were not merely irritated with me, not merely neglectful or dismissive. They were planning. They were conspiring to take what was mine, to strip me of authority under the guise of concern, to declare me incompetent and assume control over the life I had built through decades of labor and sacrifice. Richard leaned closer to Elaine, his lips barely moving as he said, "Guardianship is straightforward if the doctor signs off. We can present the case easily. He's forgetful, he repeats himself, and his hearing loss will help. Judges eat that up. It'll look like we're protecting him." Elaine nodded, her face set in determination that chilled me more than anger ever could. He'll resist, of course, but once the papers are filed, it won't matter. We'll be in charge. We'll make the decisions. It's the best thing for everyone. I wanted to stand up, to slam my fist on the table, to shout that I heard every word and that they would never succeed. But something inside me held still, some instinct honed from years of surviving not by reaction, but by patience, by waiting, by gathering evidence before making a move. Instead, I kept my expression placid, even slightly vacant, as though I were lost in thought or too tired to follow the thread of conversation. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I feared they might hear it, but outwardly I remained the image of a weary old man, nodding occasionally, smiling faintly, letting them believe their performance of secrecy was flawless. I cut another piece of potato, chewed slowly, and swallowed, while inside me a storm raged with equal measures of rage and resolve. Later that evening, after dessert had been served and the grandchildren had retreated to their rooms, I sat in the living room with Richard as the television blared a football game. He barely acknowledged me, immersed in the screen, his face lit by shifting colors that cast him in hard, angular shadows. Elaine came in, carrying a pile of papers she pretended to sort through on the coffee table, but I could see the way her eyes lingered on me, assessing, measuring, already imagining me diminished, dependent, silent. I excused myself early, pleading fatigue, and walked slowly down their front steps into the cool night air, the sound of leaves crackling underfoot, the weight of betrayal pressing heavier than the autumn chill. I clutched the railing, not because I needed support, but because the anger inside me threatened to unsteady my steps. When I reached my car, I sat for a long time with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at the empty street, listening to the faint hum of distant traffic, and I whispered aloud to myself, "So it's true. They mean to bury me while I'm still alive." That night, back in my house, I could not sleep. I paced the living room, the ticking of the clock loud in the silence. Margaret's photograph watching from the mantel as though she too were bearing witness to the cruelty of our only child. I replayed the words over and over in my head, the cold practicality with which they had spoken, as if discussing the sale of an old car or the disposal of worn-out furniture, not the fate of a man who had given them everything. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, pen in hand, scribbling down every phrase I could recall, every detail of tone and expression, determined that if they chose to wage this war in whispers, I would answer with clarity. I would not confront them yet. I would not tip my hand. But from that night on, I began to carry a notebook in my jacket pocket, a small black leather-bound book, and whenever I was with them, I wrote, casually, discreetly, noting their words, their lies, their fabrications, all of it. They thought I could not hear. They thought I was already fading. But I was listening. I was recording. I was preparing. After that evening at Elaine's house, something inside me shifted permanently, as though the quiet suspicion I had lived with for years had crystallized into an iron certainty that no longer allowed me the comfort of doubt. And from that moment forward, every interaction with my daughter and her husband carried the heavy weight of anticipation, the knowledge that I was being scrutinized not as a father or even as a man, but as a case to be built, a narrative to be shaped, a problem to be solved through paperwork and signatures that would remove me from my own life. At first, the changes were subtle, the kind of small humiliations that might have gone unnoticed by someone less attentive. But I had spent decades as an accountant balancing ledgers down to the cent, and I knew how to recognize patterns, how to trace the lines between minor anomalies until they revealed the shape of a larger design. Elaine began to speak about me in the third person, even when I sat directly across from her, saying things like, "Dad doesn't really remember what he ate yesterday," or "He gets confused in the evenings while looking at Richard," or even at the grandchildren. And each time I felt the sting of being erased, my existence reframed before my very eyes into something frail and pathetic. And yet I forced myself to remain calm, to nod politely or smile faintly, storing the words away in the notebook I kept hidden inside my jacket pocket. It was not only the words but the actions that told me the campaign against me was accelerating. One afternoon when I visited their house, I discovered that the keys to my car, which I had left on the hallway table, had been quietly removed, and when I asked where they were, Elaine laughed lightly and said she had put them in a safe place, so I wouldn't misplace them, her tone dripping with false concern as though I were a child prone to losing his toys. And though I insisted I had never misplaced my keys in all my years, she patted my hand as if to calm me, her eyes sliding toward Richard, with a knowing look that made my stomach turn. Another time, while we were at a family dinner in a restaurant, Richard ordered for me without asking, telling the waiter that I shouldn't have red meat because of my condition. Though I have never been diagnosed with anything of the sort, and when I protested quietly, Elaine leaned across the table and whispered, with that tight smile plastered on her face, "Dad, don't make a scene. Everyone will think you're confused again." I chewed the bland fish dish in silence, the laughter of my grandchildren ringing in my ears as they joked about how Grandpa zones out sometimes, each word hammering deeper into my chest. And still I made no outburst because every insult, every denial of my agency, every false story they told about me became another line in my record, another thread in the rope I would use to pull their deception into the light when the time came. The neighbors began to treat me differently as well, which told me Elaine had started spreading her narrative beyond the confines of family walls. Mrs. Cartwright from next door approached me one morning as I struggled with the garbage bin and asked in a tone far too sweet, "George, do you need me to help you with things around the house?" Elaine mentioned, "You've been having some memory trouble?" I froze, the sunlight glaring against the bin's metal edge, and forced a smile, replying that I was fine, though inside I felt the sharp cut of betrayal deepen. My daughter had begun building her case not only with whispers at the dinner table, but with carefully seeded rumors in the neighborhood, creating the impression of a man slipping into incompetence. Soon after, the mailman paused at my porch to ask if I had thought about arranging someone to collect my mail for me, in case I forgot, his casual tone carrying the unmistakable trace of a story planted by someone close. I realized then that they were not only preparing documents but preparing the world, ensuring that by the time papers were filed, no one would be surprised to hear that old George Whitaker could no longer manage on his own. What hurt the most was how naturally the grandchildren absorbed these narratives, how easily they began to treat me as fragile, laughable, diminished. My grandson Matthew once snatched the salt shaker from my hand at the dinner table, chuckling that Grandpa doesn't remember the doctor told him no, salt, though no doctor had ever said such a thing. And my granddaughter Lily rolled her eyes one afternoon when I asked about her college plans, saying, "I already told you, Grandpa, don't you remember?" Though I was certain she had never told me. They were rehearsing lines given to them by Elaine and Richard, repeating fabrications until they became truths in their young minds, truths that painted me as forgetful, incompetent, a relic to be tolerated rather than respected. I could not even bring myself to blame them fully, for children believe what their parents teach them, and their parents had decided that my legacy would be one of decline rather than strength. Still, each word lodged inside me like a splinter, and I wrote them all down in my notebook, filling pages with the quiet cruelties that others might dismiss as harmless family teasing, but which I recognized as calculated steps in the slow suffocation of my independence. The first true blow came when I discovered that Elaine had spoken to my doctor without my knowledge, requesting copies of my medical records and asking leading questions about whether he had noticed cognitive decline. The doctor, an overworked man, who had always been kind enough but rarely paid much attention beyond the basics, mentioned it to me casually during a checkup, saying, "Your daughter is very concerned about you, George. She's worried you might not be able to handle things much." Longer, I felt my throat tighten as I forced a neutral smile and replied that it was good she cared, while inside I was screaming at the violation, the invasion, the way she twisted concern into a weapon. That night, I copied down every detail into my notebook, and for the first time I began to consider whether simply recording words would be enough, whether I might need to seek help from someone outside the family, someone who could witness the growing storm before it consumed me entirely. But still I waited, because waiting was my only advantage, because if I revealed too soon that I was listening, that I was aware, they would change their tactics, they would grow cautious, and I needed them to believe in their own deception long, enough to build their case fully, to commit themselves so completely to the lie that there would be no retreat when I chose to expose them. The nights grew longer as I sat at my kitchen table, my pen scratching furiously across the pages, my heart aching with the weight of isolation. Sometimes I spoke aloud to Margaret's photograph, telling her what was happening, imagining her voice in return, firm and steady, telling me to endure, to be strong, to let them think they had the upper hand until the moment came to strip it away. And though there were times when exhaustion made me wonder if perhaps I was mad, if perhaps they were right and I was losing pieces of myself, each morning I awoke to the same clarity. I heard them, I remembered, and I would not let them bury me, alive. The breaking point came on a gray Thursday morning in late November, when a letter arrived in my mailbox that confirmed everything I had feared. A letter printed on heavy legal paper, stamped with the seal of the county court, and addressed not to me, as a respected citizen or even as a patient in need of care, but as the subject of a petition for guardianship filed by my own daughter and her husband. My hands trembled as I unfolded the pages, the words blurring slightly as my eyes moved over them. But the meaning was clear enough. Elaine and Richard had formally requested that the court declare me incompetent to manage my own affairs, citing medical concerns, memory lapses, and diminished hearing as justification for granting them full authority over my finances, my property, and even my medical decisions. Reading those lines, I felt a mixture of rage, despair, and something like vindication, for the whispers had now become a written accusation, an official declaration of their intentions. And though the betrayal cut deeper than any wound I had suffered on the battlefield or in life, it also steeled me, hardening my resolve in a way that mere suspicions never could. The days leading up to the court date were filled with a surreal quiet, as though the world itself were holding its breath. I went about my routines with deliberate calm, brewing my coffee, feeding the birds in the yard, paying my bills carefully, each act performed with the precision of a man determined to prove his competence not only to others, but to himself. At night, I gathered my notebooks, spreading them across the kitchen table like battle plans, reading over the lines I had written in cramped handwriting, phrases recorded verbatim from conversations where they believed me deaf. He doesn't need to be handling money anymore. Dad forgets things all the time. We'll get control soon. Each phrase was a weapon, sharpened by patience, and I copied them neatly into a separate journal, preparing to present them if the chance arose. I even practiced in front of the mirror, speaking slowly and clearly, reminding myself that clarity was my greatest defense, that if I faltered or appeared confused for even a moment, it would be seized upon as proof of their accusations. When the day of the hearing arrived, I dressed with care, wearing my best suit, the one I had saved for weddings and funerals, and I stood in the hallway of the courthouse feeling the weight of history pressing down on me, the ghosts of those who had fought battles of justice in rooms like this, whispering that dignity was its own form of armor. Elaine and Richard stood across the hall with their lawyer, speaking in hushed tones, glancing at me with the smug assurance of people who believe victory is already theirs. Elaine's expression carried an edge of concern painted over with a veneer of self-righteousness, while Richard exuded cold efficiency, his eyes flicking over me as though I were a number on a spreadsheet. When we entered the courtroom, I sat silently at the table reserved for the respondent, my hands folded neatly, my notebooks tucked inside my briefcase, and I felt the familiar rhythm of my heartbeat slow, the way it had in Vietnam before a patrol, that strange calm that precedes either survival or destruction. The proceedings began with their lawyer painting a portrait of me that bore only passing resemblance to the man I am, describing me as frail, confused, prone to forgetfulness, a danger to myself and to others if left to manage my affairs. He cited examples fed to him by Elaine and Richard, stories of imaginary incidents where I supposedly left the stove on, wandered the neighborhood in a daze, or forgot to take essential medication. Each lie stung, not only because it was false, but because it was delivered with such practiced sincerity that I could see the judge nodding slightly, making notes as though these inventions carried weight. Elaine herself took the stand, her voice trembling just enough to convey the image of a dutiful daughter reluctantly forced into action, speaking of her deep concern for my safety, her fear that without intervention I might fall victim to scams or accidents. I watched her carefully, the way her eyes watered on command, the way she paused to dab at her cheek with a tissue, and I realized with a sick twist of recognition that my own child had become an actress in a courtroom drama designed to strip me of everything I had worked for. But the true turning point came when, during a pause in the testimony, Elaine and Richard leaned close to each other at their table, whispering in voices they thought inaudible, their lawyer shuffling papers to cover the sound. I sat still, my gaze fixed on the table before me, but my ears, imperfect though they may be, caught the words as clearly as if they had been shouted. Richard murmured, "He looks tired. This will be easy." And Elaine replied, "Don't worry, he doesn't hear us. He never does. He just sits there lost." The casual cruelty of it struck me like a blow, not only because of the words themselves, but because they revealed their arrogance, their certainty that I was nothing more than a shadow, a mute witness to my own dismantling. In that instant, something inside me solidified, a decision made with absolute clarity. I would not simply defend myself. I would dismantle their lies with the very arrogance they had displayed, turning their whispers into my thunder. When the judge finally asked if I wished to make a statement, I rose slowly, feeling the stiffness in my knees, but also the strength of purpose coursing through me, and I began to speak in a clear, steady voice that carried across the courtroom. I did not raise my volume, for I wanted each word to be deliberate, undeniable, the voice of a man who had listened long enough and would no longer be silent. I repeated, word for word, the phrases Elaine and Richard had just whispered, mimicking not only their words, but their tone, their dismissive certainty, their quiet laughter. The courtroom fell into stunned silence, the lawyer's pen frozen mid-air, the judge leaning forward with sudden interest. I continued, pulling my notebook from my briefcase and opening it to the pages filled with months of careful records. And I began to read aloud the catalog of lies, insults, and manipulations they had spoken in my presence, each phrase a nail hammered into the coffin of their case. Elaine's face drained of color. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and for the first time in years, I felt the balance of power tilt in my direction, not because I shouted, not because I demanded, but because I had borne witness with patience, and now I spoke with truth. The courtroom silence after I spoke those words hung heavy, as though every person present had suddenly realized that the script they expected to witness had been torn apart. And while the judge scribbled notes with renewed intensity and the opposing lawyer shuffled his papers in frantic disarray, I felt a clarity I had not felt in years, a strange kind of triumph that came not from victory achieved, but from survival, earned through patience and endurance. Yet what followed in the days and weeks after that hearing proved that the battle was far from over. For Elaine and Richard, humiliated by the exposure of their whispers and the unveiling of their lies, did not retreat quietly into shame, as a part of me had naively hoped. Instead, they doubled their efforts, twisting their narrative into darker shapes, reaching further into deception, as though determined to crush me fully, if only to restore the illusion of control they had so carefully constructed. It began with their sudden escalation of medical claims, a barrage of documents and statements presented to the court that supposedly demonstrated my decline, pages filled with the signatures of doctors I had not seen in years, vague phrases about possible early cognitive impairment, and speculative notes suggesting that the patient may not reliably recall recent events. At first glance, these documents carried the appearance of authority, but when I examined them closely, I saw the cracks, dates that did not align with my appointments, signatures that looked hurried and suspicious, and phrases so general that they could have been copied from any medical textbook. Still, the sheer weight of paperwork created the illusion of substance, and I could see that the court, already conditioned to believe stories of decline in men my age, was tempted to lean on the comfort of written reports rather than the inconvenient clarity of my testimony. Elaine and Richard also turned outward beyond the courtroom, planting their narrative in the fertile soil of community gossip. Neighbors, who once greeted me with casual politeness, began to tilt their heads with pity when they saw me, offering to fetch my groceries, or suggesting that I might consider moving into assisted living for my own good. At church, whispers floated. Behind me in the pews, people murmuring about how sad it was that I was losing touch with reality. And though no one said it outright, I could feel Elaine's hand in each rumor, her quiet persistence in reshaping me into a cautionary tale of aging, her campaign of erasure continuing even as I fought to hold on to myself. The humiliation was sharper than I expected, for it is one thing to be betrayed in private, but another to be diminished in the eyes of a community that once knew you as strong and capable. Each Sunday I sat through the hymns with a heavy chest, the words catching in my throat, and when the service ended, I walked home slowly, aware that even those who smiled at me now did so with an undercurrent of doubt. The grandchildren, too, became pawns in their campaign, their voices carrying the rehearsed lines of their parents as though they were reciting scripts from a play. Matthew called me one evening, his voice hesitant, telling me that Mom said I should stop driving because it wasn't safe anymore. And when I asked him gently if he believed that, he fell silent, then muttered that he didn't know what to believe. Before changing the subject quickly, Lily sent me a text with a link to a brochure for a retirement community, writing, "Grandpa, maybe this would be nice for you. Lots of activities." The words lighthearted, but the implication heavy. I realized then how deeply Elaine had woven her narrative, how she had enlisted her own children not through cruelty, but through the manipulation of concern, teaching them to see me not as the man who once lifted them onto his shoulders, who taught them to ride bikes and told them stories by the fireplace, but as a fragile relic in need of supervision. That manipulation cut deeper than any personal insult, for it stole from me the very legacy I had hoped to leave them, the memory of a grandfather who was strong, dependable, and wise, and replaced it with an image of weakness that would linger in their minds long after I am gone. Richard, always the strategist, escalated further by attempting to seize control of my financial accounts. I discovered through a vigilant bank manager who had known me for years that they had attempted to transfer a large sum from one of my savings accounts into a joint account that Elaine had opened, claiming I had authorized it verbally. When the bank questioned the authorization, Richard produced a copy of my signature on a document I had never seen before, a forgery so clumsy that the loops of the letters bore no resemblance to my careful handwriting. The bank froze the request and notified me immediately, but the shock of seeing my name twisted into a weapon left me trembling with rage. That evening, I sat at my desk, penning a long statement to my attorney, documenting every incident, every forgery, every manipulation, determined to counter not only their lies, but their theft, to prove not only my competence, but their corruption. I slept little that night, my mind replaying every decision I had made as a father, wondering how the girl I once carried on my shoulders, who once clutched my hand in fear of the dark, had become a woman willing to steal from me while I still breathed. The second hearing brought their desperation into sharper focus. Their lawyer presented a witness, a neighbor who claimed to have seen me wandering in confusion down the street one evening, Though I knew exactly what he was referring to, the night I had walked after dinner, taking the long way around the block to clear my mind. He described me as disoriented, muttering to myself, unable to find my way home. And though I protested calmly, pointing out that I had taken the same walk dozens of times, the image he painted lingered in the courtroom, feeding into the narrative they sought to build. When I took the stand again, I forced myself to speak with calm authority, recounting the details of that walk with precision, noting the time, the streets, the houses I passed, even the dogs I had seen barking behind fences. My clarity undercut his testimony, but I could feel the exhaustion in the judge's gaze, the weariness of a system more accustomed to siding with the young protectors than the aging defendant. And yet, despite their efforts, there were cracks in their performance, cracks I exploited quietly. During recess, I caught sight of Richard scrolling on his phone, showing Elaine messages from their lawyer that spoke openly about strategy, and though I could not see the words clearly, I recognized enough to understand that they were worried. Worried that my precision, my calmness, my evidence were stronger than they had anticipated. Later, when Elaine testified again, her voice faltered when I asked her directly whether she remembered the night she claimed I left the stove on, because in fact she and Richard had been out of town that week, a fact I proved with receipts and emails she had forgotten existed. The color drained from her face as the judge raised an eyebrow, and for a brief moment the mask of the dutiful daughter slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. That moment was small, almost imperceptible, but it fed me strength, reminding me that their lies, no matter how carefully crafted, were vulnerable to truth. Still, their retaliation grew sharper outside the courtroom. One afternoon, I returned home to find my mailbox stuffed with pamphlets for retirement homes, all addressed to me, clearly ordered by Elaine or Richard as a cruel reminder of their intentions. Another day, I discovered that my utility account had been tampered with, the online access reset under the claim that I had forgotten my password, though I had never shared it with anyone. Each of these acts was small in isolation, but together they formed a pattern of harassment, a relentless campaign to wear me down, to convince me that resistance was futile. Yet rather than weaken me, each attempt only hardened my resolve. For every pamphlet, every tampered account, every whispered insult was another entry in my growing archive, another weapon I would wield when the time came. The lowest moment came when Elaine confronted me directly. Outside the courthouse after a particularly grueling day, she approached me with tears in her eyes. Though whether they were genuine or conjured for effect, I could not tell. And she said softly, "Dad, why are you fighting us? We're only trying to protect you. Don't you want to make things easier for yourself?" Her words cut deep, not because of their content, but because of the intimacy of their tone. The way she still called me Dad as though that single word could mask the betrayal. I looked into her eyes and saw the girl she once was, the child who used to fall asleep on my chest while I read to her, and for a fleeting moment, my heart ached with the desire to believe her, to forgive her, to imagine that somewhere beneath the ambition and greed, my daughter still loved me. But then I remembered the whispers, the forged signatures, the pamphlets, the humiliation, and the ache hardened into steel. I told her quietly, "If you wanted to protect me, you would have sat at my table and asked me what I wanted, not whispered about how to take it away." Her face twisted, the tears vanishing as quickly as they had come, replaced by cold anger, and she hissed, "You'll regret this. You can't fight us forever." It was in that moment I realized that what began as whispers at a dinner table had grown into a full war for my dignity, my autonomy, and my very identity. And though I knew the battle ahead would demand every ounce of strength left in me, I also knew that I had survived far worse, that I had walked through jungles where death hid behind every tree, that I had buried the woman I loved more than life, that I had endured nights of solitude so heavy they threatened to crush me. Compared to those battles, this was different, yes, but it was not beyond me. They believed they could erase me with paperwork and whispers, but I was still here, still listening, still recording, still fighting, and I vowed that if they wanted escalation, I would meet them not with despair, but with truth, wielded like a blade, sharpened by patience and memory. The final hearing arrived on a bitterly cold January morning, the kind of morning when the air itself feels sharpened into knives, and every breath stings the lungs. And as I buttoned my coat and looked at myself in the mirror before leaving the house, I felt the heavy gravity of what the day meant, for it was not simply another step in a legal process, but the culmination of years of quiet humiliations, whispered betrayals, and calculated erasures, all converging in one last attempt by my daughter and her husband to declare me incapable of being the man I still knew myself to be. The courthouse loomed gray and indifferent against the winter sky, and when I stepped inside the echoing halls, the marble floors cold beneath my shoes, I felt as though I were entering not just a building, but an arena where everything I had left, my dignity, my freedom, my legacy, would either be stripped away or restored. Elaine and Richard stood waiting with their lawyer, their faces carefully composed, but I could see in Richard's narrowed eyes and Elaine's clenched jaw that their patience was fraying, that the weeks of resistance had chipped at their confidence. And yet they clung to the belief that the system favored them, that the narrative of decline was stronger than the truth of endurance. When the proceedings began, their lawyer launched into what he clearly believed was the decisive assault, presenting thick folders of medical documents, affidavits, and neighbor statements, each one crafted to portray me as a man slipping away, a danger to himself if left unguarded. He spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being believed, weaving a tale of confusion and decline, and I listened in silence, my hands folded on the table, every muscle taut with the effort of patience. Elaine took the stand next, her voice soft, trembling, every phrase dripping with the carefully rehearsed sorrow of a daughter, forced into a painful decision for the sake of her father's well-being. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, spoke about sleepless nights worrying for me, told stories of incidents that had never happened, how she supposedly found me wandering in the yard in the middle of the night, how I'd left a pot boiling on the stove until smoke filled the kitchen, how I had forgotten her birthday entirely. Each lie fell from her lips with the ease of practice, and I watched, my chest burning with the betrayal of it, yet my face remained calm, my notebook resting on the table like a weapon I would soon unsheathe. Then came Richard, and his testimony was cold, methodical, designed not to stir sympathy but to convince through efficiency. He spoke of financial missteps, of alleged forgotten payments and misplaced checks, of how I had nearly been scammed by a telemarketer, though the truth was I had hung up immediately on that call. He described me as stubborn, unwilling to face reality, insisting that guardianship was not a betrayal, but an act of necessity, the responsible choice for a family, forced to care for an aging parent. His words were slick, polished, and I could see the judge listening carefully, weighing each phrase, and for a moment a heavy dread pressed against me, the fear that truth might not be enough, that the machinery of appearances and paperwork could still crush me regardless of what I said. But then Richard leaned too close to Elaine as he left the stand, and in the hush of the courtroom I heard him mutter, This is almost done. He's finished. He won't hear us anyway. Elaine gave a small nod, her lips tightening as she whispered back, "He's gone. He just doesn't know it yet." It was that arrogance, that fatal underestimation, that gave me the fire I needed. And when the judge turned at last and asked if I wished to make a statement, I rose slowly to my feet, my knees aching, but my spine straight, and I placed both hands firmly on the table before me. The courtroom fell into stillness as I began to speak, my voice low but steady, each word measured, deliberate, not rushed, not shouted, but carrying the weight of a man who had borne years of silence and now demanded to be heard. "Your Honor," I began, "they believe I cannot hear them. They whisper as if I were already gone, as if I were deaf to their words and blind to their intentions. But I hear everything. I remember everything. And I will repeat to you word for word what they have said in this very room." Then, without glancing at my notes, I repeated exactly what Richard and Elaine had just whispered, mimicking their tone, their dismissive certainty, their cruelty disguised as pity. Gasps rippled through the room. The judge's pen stilled midair, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Elaine's face crumbled, her composure shattering into panic. I did not stop there. I pulled from my briefcase the notebook I had kept for months, the pages filled with my careful handwriting, and I opened it for the judge to see. I read entry after entry, each one a direct quote from conversations where they had spoken in front of me as though I were invisible. The nights they whispered about selling my house, the mornings they discussed forging signatures, the afternoons they mocked my memory, the evenings they laughed that he can't hear us anyway. I read until the weight of their words filled the courtroom like stones piling higher and higher, and with each phrase I spoke, Elaine shrank further into her chair, while Richard's jaw tightened, his fists clenching on the table. When at last I closed the notebook, I looked directly at the judge and said, "They would bury me alive for the sake of control. They would strip from me the dignity I have earned through a lifetime of service and sacrifice, and they would do it by whispering lies in rooms where they believed I was too far gone to hear. But I am here, I hear them, I remember. And I will not surrender my life to their greed." The silence that followed was absolute, and though the judge said nothing immediately, I could see in his eyes that something had shifted, that the carefully constructed image of a declining old man had been torn down, replaced by the undeniable presence of a man who had endured, who had borne witness, who had spoken the truth with clarity that no paperwork could erase. Elaine began to cry openly, the tissue crumpled in her hand, her voice breaking as she tried to protest. But her words stumbled over themselves, tangled in the net of her own lies. Richard sat rigid, his face pale, the calculation in his eyes betraying the realization that their plan, so carefully plotted, had collapsed under the simple weight of my patience and memory. When I sat down, my body trembling with exhaustion but my heart steady, I felt Margaret's presence as though she were standing behind me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder, whispering the strength she had always given me. For the first time in many years, I did not feel invisible. I did not feel erased. I felt like a man again, standing tall, not because I had been spared humiliation, but because I had endured it, recorded it, and turned it back against those who sought to destroy me. And as the judge cleared his throat and prepared to speak, I knew that whatever the ruling, the truth had already been spoken, and no whisper could ever silence it again. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was steady, deliberate, and though he kept the formal restraint of his position, there was a weight in his words that carried more than law. It carried recognition, and in that recognition, I felt the cold iron grip of fear that had bound me for months begin to loosen. He said plainly that the petition for guardianship was denied, that the evidence provided by Elaine and Richard had been inconsistent, unreliable, and in several instances contradicted by fact, and though he did not use the word fraud, his tone carried the implication. He noted that my testimony had been precise, my recall strong, and my ability to articulate myself unimpaired. And he closed with the statement that no court should strip a man of his autonomy without cause. And in this case, there was none. The gavel struck, the papers were shuffled, and just like that, the machinery of their betrayal ground to a halt, leaving behind not the victory they had imagined, but the ruins of their own scheme. Elaine sobbed quietly, clutching the crumpled tissue in her hand, her face blotched with the strain of a daughter who had chosen ambition over love and failed, while Richard's jaw remained clenched, his anger simmering beneath the mask of stoicism, his eyes fixed forward as if refusing to acknowledge that the ground had collapsed beneath his feet. Their lawyer gathered the folders of papers quickly, avoiding my gaze, already eager to escape the room that had transformed from their theater of conquest into their chamber of exposure. I remained seated for a long moment, breathing slowly, feeling the tremor in my hands subside, until the judge rose and left the bench, and only then did I allow myself to stand. I gathered my notebook, my briefcase, the careful records that had been my shield and my sword, and I walked out of that courtroom not as a defeated old man, but as a survivor who had endured every humiliation, every whispered insult, every attempt to erase him, and had answered not with rage but with patience, memory, and truth. Outside, the air was sharp and bright, the winter sun low against the horizon, glinting off the courthouse windows, and as I stood on the steps, the cold biting at my face, I felt a strange calm, not triumph, not joy, but something quieter, deeper, the restoration of dignity. Elaine and Richard hurried past me without a word, their footsteps quick, their faces turned away, and I did not call after them, for there was nothing left to say. Blood ties had been broken long before this day, in whispers and schemes, in signatures forged and stories invented, and though the law had sided with me, the bond of family had already dissolved into something unrecognizable. They had shown me who they were, and I could not unsee it. That night, I returned home to my quiet house, the walls lined with photographs of a life that seemed impossibly distant, yet still mine to claim. And I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the notebook before me, its pages filled with the record of betrayal. I did not burn it, as some might have, nor did I place it on a shelf to gather dust. I left it open, the words staring back at me, not as a wound, but as a testament, proof that even when they whispered that I could not hear, I listened. Even when they believed I was fading, I remembered. Even when they thought they had erased me, I endured. I thought of Margaret, of how she would have smiled at my stubbornness, how she would have reminded me that justice is not always loud, but often steady, carried in the quiet insistence of truth. I whispered aloud into the stillness, "We did it, love." We held on. In the weeks that followed, I received calls from neighbors, some apologetic, some curious, each of them realizing that the stories they had believed were not truths, but inventions. At church, people looked at me differently, not with pity, but with a kind of respect tinged with discomfort, as though they had been complicit in my erasure and now struggled to reconcile it. My grandchildren did not come around, and perhaps they will not for some time. For the version of me their parents built in their minds will take years to undo, if it ever does. But I no longer ache for their approval, as I once did, for I have learned that dignity does not come from the validation of others, but from the refusal to surrender it when threatened. I made one final decision in the aftermath, one that brought me both sorrow and release. I rewrote my will, not out of vengeance, but out of clarity, removing Elaine and Richard as beneficiaries, ensuring that what I leave behind will not reward betrayal. Instead, I named a Veterans Foundation and a scholarship fund for children in need, knowing that even in death, my legacy will not be defined by those who sought to strip me of my worth, but by acts that affirm it. Perhaps one day Elaine will understand what she lost, but that is no longer my burden to carry. Now, in the quiet of my days, I rise each morning, make my coffee, and sit by the window with a steady heart. I feed the birds, watch the snow drift across the yard, and I allow myself to breathe without the weight of their whispers pressing down on me. For the first time in years, I feel not erased but present, not diminished but whole. And though I know that time will still take its toll, as it does with all men, I will meet it on my own terms, with my memory intact, my dignity unbroken, and my voice still clear. They whispered that I could not hear, but in the end, I repeated every word, and in that act I reclaimed myself, not only in the eyes of the court, but in the quiet sanctuary of my own soul.